So you know me, I like to get those bombshells out of the way early. So I'm afraid this game scored incredibly well. I think it's like the fifth. Actually, I can check real quick. It's like the fifth highest rated game under my current review system. Yep, number 5. Yeah, that says all I think it needs to be completely blunt. One of the biggest things I was worried about walking into it was about something I call the honeymoon period, which is a problem I have, I say had. It's a problem I have that I'm aware of. I think that's probably the best way to explain that. The idea is, let's say I play a game that sucks. Ugh. Then I play a game that's much better, and it's like, yeah. And I'm willing to be a lot more positive towards that game because of that, right? And, well, that doesn't just apply to games like that, though, because I could play a game that's really good, and then play another game and get a little bit too into it before I realize it's not as good as I think it is. This is further made problematic because a lot of games, and I do mean a lot of games, probably the majority of games, tend to fall apart the further into the game you get. It is truly rare to have a game that maintains quality all the way to the end. I don't mean that as an insult, that's a statement of fact. An inordinate number of development teams, developments of video games tend to be like, all right, oh God, we're out of time or money or budget or something, gunk, and there you go, right? It's pretty common. So this is problematic, and it's something I try to be aware of and not be too positive towards the beginning of a game, which is good because when I first picked up this game, I was just going, oh my God, this is so good. Ignoring how much better or worse it is. Let's just throw Psychonauts 1 out the window for a moment. Not like that. I don't mean as an insult. God, come on, you already know what I mean. My point is, remove it from the equation, and this game still plays very well, very tightly, very smoothly. It has basically all the gameplay hallmarks that have been invented over the last 16 years that actually make platforming better. It's one of the reasons I've actually posited this several times before. I've said that the Mario series, each game that came out in the main Mario 3D platformers from 64 to Sunshine to Galaxy 2 to 3D World to Odyssey, each one of those has been improving all the stuff you don't see that makes the game smoother and more fun to play. It's one of the reasons why Odyssey sits at the top for me in terms of 3D platformers, and honestly, it kind of goes backwards from there. Odyssey's at the top, and then 3D World, and then Galaxy 2 and Galaxy 1, and then Sunshine's down here, and then 64. God, Sunshine was so bad. I'm sorry, I'm roaming a little bit. For those of you not aware, the reason this is a little bit of a delayed video is I'm still sick. The good news is I'm not coughing every 2 minutes, which is the main reason I hesitated on recording this. But on the bad side, my head is still filled with Play-Doh, so I do hope you'll forgive me for this one. But I hope all of this is getting across a point. If you've played Hat in Time, that's probably the game this most felt like to play. Didn't quite have the movement tech, but overall still had a whole lot of stuff you could do and a whole lot of little nitty-gritty details in order to make the game just fun. We've talked about this before with regards to platformers, and it's something that can absolutely make or break a game, because it can make a gameplay experience worse or better, and it's interpretive inputs. I don't know what it's properly called, I don't care. The point is, you can tell me, I don't care. The point is that if I go to climb up for something, the game could say, oh, you're probably trying to reach this spot, and can kind of nudge you a little bit there, or make sure that you specifically grab the spot. Because as I've pointed out before, a game that doesn't do little stuff behind the background is actually really unpleasant to play. For example, let me just name one very, very simple example. Let's say there's a staircase, and let's say the staircase is actually rendered, so it's not actually a ramp, textured to look like a staircase, but it is actually a staircase. Well, if you run into that, then you will stop, because that's a wall. You could jump up it, of course, but you could see how that would be problematic. And this is one of the reasons why staircases tend to be ramps. But if you wanted it to be a staircase, you could still add a little bit of tech that says, okay, they're going full tilt here into something that's a slight bump up. They'd probably want to just hop up very quickly to there. Hop, 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 and so forth and so on. That's a terrible example. The ledge grab is probably the most common example. But there are dozens of tiny little details that people have invented over the last 16 years in order to make platforming more enjoyable. And I tend to appreciate almost all of those things, and they employed all of them in this game. So even ignoring everything else, just playing the game, actually the action of sitting there and using the controller, was substantially improved for me. So that's point number 1 in its favor. Point number 2 is the level design really feels expanded upon what they could do in the original. Now, I phrase it that way because I'm not trying to throw shade at the original. Remember, that's over there out the window, playing on the field with the dog and the puppy and the flowers. The point is, that was 16 years ago. Nowadays, we have better technology, better understanding of concepts and gimmicks. The literal engine can accomplish more, and so they are able to do more, and so they do. And there's a lot of examples of that. I'm not going to go down the list, but there are dozens upon dozens of examples where the level design is just creative and fun and interesting in ways that the original game couldn't do because they didn't have the tech or the time or the expertise or the anything, right? So level design, benefit in almost every way. The actual act of controlling the game, better in almost every way. Let's talk about the combat. The combat is actually much smoother and, ironically, much harder than the original game in a way that I actually appreciate, especially since I'm going to pause for a moment and mention that there's some accessibility options in the menu. Now, I don't mean the usual stuff, although they do have the option to turn off like motion blur and all that fun stuff. But what I mean is more along the lines of they have the option to say, let's turn off falling damage so you don't have to worry about that. Okay, that's cool. Or you could turn off the ability to take damage from enemies. Or just make all the combat extremely easy if you just want to enjoy the platforming and the puzzling and just remove combat from the equation. That's awesome. And there's no detriment for it, too. It's just a toggle. There you go. Have fun. Great feature. I think this is one of the only games I have played, or reviewed, that actually has this kind of thing. One of the other ones which sits so highly in my mind is Celeste, which did a similar thing and was awesome for it. But even ignoring the fact that you can turn all that off, I didn't do any of that, of course, because I actually liked the combat and the fact that it was much harder and more frenetic. First of all, you can actually chain abilities into other abilities, that is to say attacks. So there's possibilities of combos now, but more to the point, some of your attacks react differently based on how you're controlling it. So 2 big things I'm going to point out here. First of all, your melee combo has a closer now, which means, enemies over here, I'm over here, I want to attack them. I don't have to run up and hit attack. I can hit attack and I will lunge towards them. I may not make it the whole way, that's on me for aiming it and making sure I'm the right distance, but I can at least get closer to them with a simple button press. This is something that Kingdom Hearts honestly took until the second game to really figure out, but once it did, is one of the reasons why Kingdom Hearts was so much fun to play, was because it had that closer tech. And there's a lot more complexity in that I'm not going to go into right now, but you get the idea. And while you're doing attacks, you can interrupt your attacks with other attacks. So you have animation interruption or animation canceling in addition to that. So you can chain abilities, close on enemies, and you have animation canceling. Also, one other thing that's minor, but actually feels major when used, you have 4 buttons now for your abilities instead of 3. This actually worked really, really well because it means you have a lot more options in how you can do it. One very minor complaint. I didn't give the game a negative for this, but I wish they had added a loadouts feature. Because I noticed by the end of the game there were about 3 loadouts I used consistently. One for just general platforming, one for certain types of combat, and one for other types of combat. And I wish I could just, hit a button and swap between those at will, but whatever. Point being, with the additional ability that you could have, on your hotbars right there, on your shoulder buttons, I was playing with a controller, consequently, that opens up a surprising amount of complexity of what you can do in combat. Especially since the levitate thing works even better than it ever did before. So you can just use that effectively to slide, run, dash, whatever you want to call that, out of the way, while never actually stopping to attack the enemy. Which brings me to the second thing I was going to bring up. Yes, I didn't forget about it. Any of your shoot abilities are now primarily predicated on your camera. This can be good or bad. In my experience, it's more good than bad. Because what it means is you can have maneuvers while still actually attacking or interacting with the enemy that's chasing you. If you're trying to do this thing to get around an attack, you can shoot at them the entire time because your camera is still facing at them, right? So all that's cool. So, control's better, level's better, combat's better. I should probably also mention that there's a lot of other cool stuff. I really shouldn't go down the list. Go watch the stream. It's not that long of a stream. I will just do nothing but gush about so many aspects of the gameplay. But what I'm trying to get across here is that the gameplay is better in basically every way. The only thing they didn't fix was the fact that it still has the GTA 4 problem like the first game did, which I should probably explain. So, I call this the GTA 4 problem because that's probably the worst example of this. It's accidental skipping. How many of you have ever played a game, I'm sure you can think of several, where someone's talking, someone's actually engaging in a bit of dialogue, and you can clearly see, like, the quest is right there in front of you, and you stop dead because you don't want to interrupt the dialogue. Like I said, GTA 4 was really bad about that because they would have... GTA 4 literally knows how long, a chunk of gameplay is going to be, because most of the time you're not even driving. And then they would record dialogue for this long, and they did it consistently. The first game had this problem a bit, and this game has that problem as well. There are several sections where you just have to stop dead and discontinue activity in order to let the characters actually finish their dialogue. Far Cry does this a lot too, to name it. A lot of games do this. It's kind of weirdly common. I guess it's a form of skippable cutscenes, but it's weird the way it tends to be implemented. But whatever. Anyways, that's a minor complaint. That hasn't been improved. But everything else has. Which brings me, of course, to the visuals. Now, I had several people give me the same response as we were playing through this game. Because remember, we did this right after Psychonauts 1. In fact, we finished Psychonauts 1 in the morning shift, sat down, recorded the video, and then for the afternoon and evening shift, we went ahead and played Psychonauts 2. So literally the same day, we went from Game 1 to Game 2. The first game had the detriment of being in the brown era of gaming. Now, it's not as brown as a lot of other games I can mention, including the aforementioned GTA 4, but it did still have a bit of the problems of that era of gaming. Didn't quite have HD textures yet, and leaned a little bit too heavily on dirtier, grittier colors in general, and bloom, and a bit of blurring as well. And a lot of games in the brown era have that same kind of concept in terms of visuals. And just to answer this, because I keep getting this question every time I bring up the brown era, someone says, why did developers do this? It's because those tools were new. They were brand new tech that they could use and they could actually do. And of course, they did the same thing every developer has done ever when they get a brand new piece of tech. They overused it. This is actually true across gaming. It's just most of the time you don't really notice when something gaining the ability to be transparent is being overused, especially since that's just kind of a neat little thing, right? Because that was a thing they did back in, I guess that would be the mid-'80s at that point, mid-early 80s, when they figured out how to be able to have a sprite that had a transparency layer, or not a layer, actually, more like a transparency pixels on it. And so it's like, hey, look, we can do all this cool stuff. And they just overused it. They do this constantly. This is just normal. So the brown era is just rather infamous because A, a lot of games were made in that era, especially games that are well known, and B, it looks like crap. It's okay, we're out of that, because this game is much more vibrant and uses color much better. Now, I don't just mean that as an aesthetic thing, although I had a lot of comments saying the game was a lot easier on the eyes. Some people had actually bowed out of the first game's viewings because it was bothering them visually. But more to the point, it's more distinct. Something I'm really harsh about when it comes to game design is visual distinction. I need to be able to look at something on a screen and be able to tell what I'm looking at pretty much like that in most games. Whether it's a turn-based strategy game or a SimCity game or a builder of some kind, or if it's a survival game or if it's an action game or whatever, that kind of visual distinction is important. And visual distinction comes down to a lot of things. Lighting is a big thing in it, and what kind of colors you put against what kind of other colors is also part of that. So I immediately noticed that the figments were better done in this game. First of all, they actually thought about which color the figment should be based on what backdrop it was on, so it's a lot easier to be seen because of that. That's the first thing they did, and that's kind of a manually crafted thing, but since all the figments are manually placed, that makes sense. But the point is they put the thought and effort into it. Good job. The other thing they did was they actually made sure to put a bit of an outline around the colors so that the colors pop out a little bit more, so you can actually see them more distinctly. Again, a minor touch, but very well appreciated. They also made sure to use lighting better. I could sit here and talk for literally hours about how to do proper lighting in gaming, because it's so much more complicated than just making a light source and showing it over here. Anybody who's worked in lighting knows how much thought and effort and work goes into making the right lights from the right sources, with the right refractions, with the right color and tone balance, and all the other dozens of things that goes into that. Just trust me when I say the lighting design was much better in this game. One thing that I like to use as a hallmark for lighting design in a game is if there's an area that's dark, but you can still tell what's going on clearly and distinctly. Because there's a talent to that, to making something look dark, but still distinct. They do that in spades, which of course, excuse me, leads me to one of my only complaints, and this is something that does need to be mentioned in one of the levels. I wrote down the Psy King level, the drugs level, let's just call it what it is. When you go to the 60s drug level, excuse me, my throat's slowly dying on me here. So I'm starting to lose the ability to talk. I'm working on it. The drugs level has something called chromatic aberration, where you can have like this, and then there's like a little red or blue outline around it, and it looks awful. In fact, it was literally headache-inducing. I had to ding the game for it. Quick point out, if you're playing this on PC, this game is running on, I believe it's Unreal, but either way, you can actually find engine.ini, and I'm not going to give you the whole thing because that would take some time, but just look up removing chromatic aberration from engine.ini on Unreal Engine, and you'll be able to figure it out, because you can just disable it, which is weird because that is an option in that engine. So I'm not sure why, with all the other accessibility options they have, I'm not sure why they didn't have an option to fix that one. But I'm only pointing it out because it's one of my only complaints about the game as a whole. As an aside, even my viewers were having issues with it, and for the perspective, they were seeing this on the stream, whereas I'm looking at this. So yeah, it was literally, non-ironically, non-jokingly, non-exaggeratively giving me a headache just watching it. So thank God we fixed that one, because the level is quite creative other than that. But anyways, collecting is more interesting. For the most part, it was actually far more enjoyable. I could see myself actually going back and replaying this game sometime just to 100% it, because it's fun to play. Something we talked about a lot during these games is collectathons, for me, this is just my opinion, have to sit on the basis of being fun. I know that sounds dumb, but you know what I mean by that, right? How many collectathons can you name? Or even specific things to collect in a video game that aren't fun? They're just going around and gathering Korok seeds, you know? By contrast, I had a blast going through Mario Odyssey and getting 100% of the moons. I have actually 100% of that game. And that was fun because the overwhelming majority of them, like 99% of them, are all manually crafted little challenges. Some bite-sized, some extensive. And that's awesome. And they're fun. It's the same thing with achievements for me. You give me a platinum trophy that is, go do all this fun stuff, and I'm going to get it. You give me a platinum trophy that says, do this grindy thing, or do this stupid thing, or do this boring thing, and I'm going to say, yeah, no, I got other things to do with my time. The relevance here is this game was fun to go collect everything. Especially since a lot of it was very clearly, oh, once I get this ability, I'll be able to come back and do that. Which I suppose is a good time as any to mention the upgrades. I wasn't sure what I thought of the upgrades at first, but I really do like, first of all, just upgrading the base abilities, which more than anything feels more like unlocks than actual upgrades, but that's okay. For the most part, it does kind of change how you play, and I tend to value that more than doing 5% more damage. Furthermore, the badges were awesome. The fact that you can only equip 3 was something I was hesitant about first, but quickly grew to love because it meant there was a lot of different options and possibilities, and you could swap in and out, which once again makes me think the loadout thing is something they should have gone for, because you can just imagine just being able to switch to a melee loadout on the fly and be like, clunk, or then switch to the gathering loadout or switch to an exploration loadout. And also some of the badges made the game harder as extra optional challenge modes, so that's cool too. The bosses are fun. I don't have much to say about the bosses other than the fact that almost every single one of them got a positive, which should say something, whereas in the previous game, none of them did. But, sorry, I didn't mean to. It's, okay, we're gonna... Psychonauts 1 is kind of looking at me angrily out the window now. We're cool? Okay, we're cool. Psychonauts 1 sucks. Oh, God! No, for real, though, I really enjoyed playing this game, if it's not obvious, for however much time I've just spent trying to go into the details of why. I'm going to reiterate what I said earlier. What this game reminds me of more than anything else is A Hat in Time, which was just a treat to play, by the way. I highly recommend, if you're into this game, give A Hat in Time a try. I feel like The Hat in Time is actually inspired by Psychonauts. But anyways, I suppose you want us to talk about the story. I guess. But in order to talk about the story at all, I have to throw up the spoiler warning. In fact, I have to throw up the spoiler warning for Psychonauts 1 as well. Okay, that's good enough. I got a question twice during the run. Once from a friend and once from a viewer that said, do I have to play Psychonauts 1 to enjoy 2? No. There might be a few extra references and gags that you'll get if you do, and that's cool. But there's no requirement upon it. If you don't feel like playing Psychonauts 1, if it's not your thing, if you're pushed off by it, by the controls, or the old jank, or the graphics, or any other reason, that's fine. You don't have to. You can. I'm not trying to dissuade you. I'm just answering the question. Because this game starts with a summary of the events from Psychonauts 1, and then goes immediately into a stage that happens quite literally hours after the end of Psychonauts 1. That's the weirdest thing narratively. This whole game, that is to say this whole franchise, takes place over like a week, which is certainly weird to think about on several levels. But anyways, so we go in. We're in. All right, we're doing it. And now the first thing we have is our tutorial level, and I want to just mention this. The tutorial level is really big on teeth, okay? Teeth and gums, and it's kind of gross. I only mention this because if anybody has any issues with that, this is about as gross as it gets. The game doesn't lean on gross factor all that much, with one other notable exception, which I will talk about when we get there. It's an informative, good, excellent little tutorial which kind of gets you into the characters, personalities, and gets you to know what you need to know. Whoosh forwards, and then we get the worst part of the narrative. How many of you have ever worked as a low-level worker or an intern or been the new kid in a school project, for example? Now, I get what they were going for, but the first couple of hours, I'd say, 2 hours-ish, of story is a little bit too Nickelodeon for me. You're the loser kid who everybody makes fun of and who everybody taunts, and you fall for everything, of course. And they're all dicks to you, all of them, parents and kids equally. And it's just kind of unpleasant, for lack of a better way to put it. Now, I mention this because I actually know several people who were rather put off by this part of the story. And I don't blame them for that because I was too. I did ding it. It's one of the only dings I gave to the narrative of the entire game was this portion of the game. However, I do want to mention that once we get past this point, which is effectively the next major mission, once we go to the gambling mission, Hollis' mission, once you've done that, that part of the game is effectively over. And you can get back to just actually having a story again. Which, of course, brings me to Hollis' section. So, we jump into her mind, make a connection between money and risk, and that sets off a chain reaction which alters the way her mind thinks in unexpected and unpredictable ways, which makes perfect sense. You have directly connected two thoughts in an unnatural way, artificially forcing her brain to change. Keep that in mind. So she freaks out, and we have the casino level, which, as with the first game, most of these deal with some kind of mental illness or another, and this one is, of course, gambling addiction, or actually more accurately, I would just say addiction in general, because it tends to be, this one's kind of one of the more vague ones as far as mental health goes, and they spend a lot of time just kind of throwing out gags and random things, but it is still a very inventive and fun level. You move your way through it. We see several logical fallacies through it. We see how people think they can control and body the system and become, immersed in it, and I just have to make this more thing happen, and yada, yada, yada. And we also get the idea that the Psychonauts are woefully underfunded, because apparently even under Ford? No, that's wrong. The previous leader, whose name I can't think of right now and didn't write down, they still had financial issues, which makes me wonder why they aren't getting better funding, but let's just ignore that for a moment. There's some interesting world building in this one that paints a picture of a world that's not super great. But I'm getting off topic. Regardless, we go through the gambling level, and then you can kind of do several levels in whatever order. I'm going to kind of follow a specific order here, so I hope you'll bear with me. Because the next one we hit was Compton. Now, Compton it's a very fun thing. It's, have you ever played Overcooked? Or any of those kind of stressful, have to do X and Y in the right order in a deadline kind of a games? I use Overcooked as an example because I play that with my family, and it's awesome and wonderfully hectic as everyone's just yelling at each other. Anyways. point being that the stage is kind of like that. It's a little less hectic, except for the last one. But you have to go grab the things and take them to the spots and let them go the cooking, and they have to take a certain amount of time, so you have to be strategic about what you do. And the whole time there's platforming going on. It's awesome. But what's happening narratively is the entire time Compton is freaking out about how he can't do this. No self-confidence. Total lack of it. Almost every time, you have to step in and actually speak for him. And he's constantly talking to these 4 hand puppets, all 4 of which are based on his former comrades in the Psychonauts. Now, this seems obvious in hindsight, but each time they're spitting on him and deriding him and saying the best praise they could give him is that he's barely adequate. Not about all you, but that sounds frickin' familiar to me, because that's kind of how my mind tends to work. You know, if I do a good job on a video or a stream or a project or whatever, usually I tend to either just give someone else the credit for that, like with the theater, or, you know, it's acceptable. You know, I could do better. So it's no surprise that at the end of the level, when you finally beat the boss, which is the 3 sock puppets, and the final sock puppet is there, the camera just kind of zooms in on it, and then he just takes it off his hand because it's just him. Because it was always just him. Because that makes perfect sense. A little bit overt, but still wonderful in how subtle it is. The game does a lot of subtle overtness. It's weird the way they do it. I love it. Because it's perfect. Speaking of GTA 4, another game that does the exact same thing. But, of course, Compton is a little bit of imposter syndrome, but mostly self-esteem and lack of confidence. Once you help him work through it, once he accepts that he can do, he manages to leave the isolation chamber and go to actually become part of society again. Awesome. This then leads us to the Psy King. Now, this is an interesting one. So, I've already mentioned spoilers. This is probably one of the bigger early-on spoilers. The Psy King, who's voiced by Jack Black, is actually Fullbear. Now, if you've been paying attention to the narrative, Fullbear died during the fight against Maligula back in the deluge of Grulovia. Now, if none of those names mean anything, you don't worry about it. But the point is, he was presumed dead. What actually happened was he was being frozen in the ice, and he sneezed his brain out because, for some reason, you can sneeze your brains out in this setting. And they managed to find the brain and preserve it. But it was seriously deprived of senses for a long time. And in a surprisingly logical tint, Raz actually has to kind of connect him with the ideas of senses before and then help him to come to grips with the idea of taking in input again, because it's such a sensory overload for a brain that has been so deprived. Now, I did a little bit of looking into this, just for the heck of it. This is actually based on real-life sensory deprivation, science and research, which is really horrifying. I don't recommend anybody look into that. But obviously, we can't sneeze people's brains out in real life, but people can go into isolation chambers and sensory deprivation chambers, and it does really weird things to you. And then it does weird things to you again when you have to adapt out of that. Our brains are, of course, extraordinarily adaptive. It's their biggest strength and their greatest weakness. So the adapt in and the adapt out makes sense in the journey we go through as we're slowly trying to reconnect with the horrifically chromatic aberration level that it is. It's a fun level other than that. So we manage that. Everything's cool. We find out who he is. That's cool. We get a little bit more information about the past. But you're probably thinking, well, hang on, what's his mental health issue other than sensory deprivation? Oh, that's easy. Panic. He's the one who introduces us to panic attacks. By the way, much better enemy variety in this game than the first one. No offense, first game. Really. But the enemy variety is actually good in this game. Each enemy not only attacks you in a different way, but encourages different strategies to defeat them. That's awesome. Anyways, he is panic, and anybody out there who's ever had or suffered from panic attacks, you know why I separate that into its own little issue. Oh, other things can lead to panic attacks, of course, but panic attacks are in and of themselves kind of their own mental problem, in my opinion. And, yeah, I don't actually have anything else to help and manage that. We do talk him through it, help him to, find his center, be able to walk his way through those things, and then he comes out much stronger, better person, just in someone else's body, but whatever. This then leads us to Crawler's Mines. Now, we did his minds last. Like I said, you can kind of do these in whatever order. The first one we see is bowling. Now, I'm just going to tell you this right now. As we're going through Crowler's minds, we get exposition on what his connection was to Maligula, that is to say, to Lucretia, and we get more past on what happened with the Psychonauts 7, how the events in Grulovia happened, and all of it's lined up in a way that is actually really logical. It's a pretty tight plot. I'm going to give you the bare bones version here. These psychic people got together, got to know each other, became friends, came to this place with the funding and resources at their disposal, and did things to unlock further psychic power and connections with their minds in ways that are arguably very dangerous. They did this without oversight or restriction. Then, in that uneasy, dangerous state, one of them, Lucretia, was called home to fight in a war in Grulovia. That war had its own issues, and there's some... But the long and the short of it is that war didn't go well, and the people weren't super happy with the Tsar, and it's definitely not Russia, don't worry about it. And as a consequence, she snapped a little bit, because what she did was she started a rain store. Just a rain store. Just to dissuade... just to dissuade the protesters a bit. Then it broke the dam. And a lot of people died. And she fought in a war and killed the deaths of innocents while in a psychically vulnerable state. So what happened? A version of her, let's call it primitive side. They kind of change their mind on what it is throughout the game. To me, it's either the id or the reptilian brain. They call it the fight or flight mechanism at several points in the game. But a primal, bestial part of the brain, a part that arguably doesn't even have sentience, sapience, or intellect, just kind of rose out, became dominant, and overwhelmed the rest of her. That's Maligula, by the way. And so what we had was not so much a powerful psychic, so much as an elemental storm of nature, which was just destroying everything, because what else is there that it can do? The Psychonauts were called in to stop her. That sucked, because, former friend. But of course, Ford, who was in love with Lucretia, couldn't quite bring himself to do this. And this is the big spoiler right here. I've already given 2 spoiler warnings, but this is your third and final one, because it turns out that Cruller saved her, put some mental barriers in her brain to force her to think that she was actually her sister, who she had killed. Her sister, who happened to be Raz's grandmother. So, Raz, who is half Grulovian, manages to find out about this and realizes that the woman he has been raised to think is his grandmother for the last 20 years was actually his great aunt. And all of this has been a lie. To the game's credit, it doesn't sit and moan about the drama that this easily could have done. I know, this is a big thing, but it's treated like a big thing. I don't know how to describe this. The game's very well written in general. I'm very impressed with it. Of course, the first game was too, so that makes sense. But it makes perfect sense to me that it doesn't lean too heavily on the drama button, but still actually creates drama naturally and organically between the main characters affected by this, which is Raz, his father, the man who lost his mother 20 years ago and didn't realize it, and Ford, the one who did all this to them. And Ford, it's worth noting, at all points says he's sorry. At no point does he think he did the right thing. At no point does he try to defend himself. He's just like, I was stupid, I was young, I was dumb. We need to deal with this now. And that's another thing. He tends to focus on the immediacy of the threat, which is immediate, rather than get bogged down in that. So while we aren't really given a chance to digest what just happened, and neither are the characters, which is good, because generally speaking, if some kind of emotional impact hits and it's just allowed to shock there, we tend to react badly. It's just psychology. But if we have a moment to process it, even if the back of our minds while we're doing other things, when we get to it, we tend to approach it more reasonably, which is exactly what happens. We're not exactly happy with Ford, but over the course of one particular level, we go from being upset at our great aunt or our fake grandma to, she's my grandmother. And it's a natural progression, too. And one that makes sense. After all, she is our grandmother. She's been our grandmother since before we were born. If you're paying attention, the whole game follows this common, interesting thread. Some games have themes, some works have themes that are applicable in real life, or allegories or analogies or whatever. Some games have themes that are only, or works have themes that are only really relevant for themselves. In this case, the theme is actually relatively simple. Sorry, I was just checking something really quick. The theme here... The theme is responsibility at its most fundamental core. And that branches a little bit, because that's something that's applicable in real-day life. If we have a certain power, whether we are financially connected, whether we know people, whether people listen to us, whether we have a platform, it is incumbent upon us to be responsible with that power. And in the fictional sense, and this is what I like about this, it also applies, because fictionally speaking, these people are psychics who have the power to reach into other people's minds and change them, just like with Hollis at the beginning of the game. Raz learns this lesson. In fact, a wonderful bit of gameplay and story integration is at the beginning of the game you get several things where you can connect thoughts, and she just says random things for it. It's a neat little fun mechanic, but it never shows up again, because Raz learned his lesson and doesn't try to alter someone else's mind. In fact, another cool little tidbit is every person he jumps into the mind in, with, I think, 2 exceptions, both of them are the villains, he asks permission first. May I peek around in your mind? Because he learned to be responsible with his power. Because it hit him in the face how bad he screwed up with Hollis. She forgives him, and some people might say he got off a little easy, but I don't think so. Raz punished himself plenty for what he did, and he spends the entire rest of the game trying to do better, proving that he learned his lesson, rather than it simply being words. Remember that too, that's going to come up in a minute. What we see in multiple aspects of the game is the dangers and the terrors of using your power irresponsibly, which is exactly what Ford did. They bumble their way to success, but only because of the careful and considerate action, and even then it takes multiple efforts and coincidence for it to work out. This could have gone very badly, all because of Ford's irresponsible decision to try and save Lucretia. So, this then leads to Cruller's actual stages, which exposit everything I just told you. What I love most is, while everyone else has mental health issues, Cruller's are more primal than that. So I'm going to tell you the order I did the stages in. I did the bowling ball area first. That's fun. There's some cool gimmicks there. I like the platforming. Most of the Cruller stages are relatively bite-sized, too, which actually helps, because it means they can be really dense with what they do and how they do it. But the bowling ball stage is all about, let's call it defeatism, because I don't know what else to call that. When you walk into a situation thinking you have already lost, when you know that there's no possibility that you can accomplish that, when you don't even try, and you might think, how the heck do you get that out of the bowling level? Think about what's happening throughout the course of the stage. Think about the end is coming. Think about the bottle spread. That's right there. You can always see it at every point in the stage. You look up just a little bit, and you could see the doom of that entire city right there. And some people are still trying to build. Some people have given up. And everyone's just reacting to it differently. But the overall theme throughout the whole of that stage is, we have already lost. Which is exactly what Ford was thinking, of course. Which, of course, leads us then to the mailroom, which this is an obvious one. Doubt. What would have happened if I sent that letter? What would have happened if she took that letter and meant something of it? What would have changed if I had been there for her? What would have changed if I hadn't let her go in that vulnerable state? What would have changed if we hadn't opened our minds in such a way? Doubt. And of course, questioning ourselves. Which leads me to my next one, which is an even better one, and probably the best narrative section of the entire game, in my opinion. I loved this. We go into the hair level. Now, the hair level, on the face of it, has nothing to do with anything. Unlike the bowling level, which was connected with his first date, and the mail level, which is connected with the letters he used to correspond with her, the hair level just seems to be there. And we encounter mites. Gross things. ugly, sliming. They're slithering all over everything. And they have this really gross sound effect. And I hate it. And I actually had some people either pause or mute the stream or alt tab or otherwise, we'll come back because of how unpleasant they were. First thing I tried to do was burn them all without even meaning it. Just instantly, I pulled out the pyro thing, like, we're going to burn these suckers. Didn't do anything, but that's okay because I could kill them otherwise. Thank God I can kill all these stupid, disgusting bugs. Then we go to another section of the stage where there's even more of them. And each time, it only happens 3 times, but each time they get just a little bit different. And I'm going to freely admit I didn't catch this until the 3rd iteration. Because looking back, first they're just a bunch of bugs swarming, but then they're bugs moving in weird and interesting patterns. And the 3rd time, they're holding protest signs. This stage so neatly and efficiently shoves the player into the mindset of Maligula. That is to say, if such a thing can be said to have a mind because primitive brain, etc. But you get the idea. Because this is exactly what Maligula was thinking. There's not any real intellect or concept there, just bare bones primal instinct. Gross, die. That's it. And that's exactly how I reacted. And a lot of people in chat did too. And it's brilliant the way they do it. This is the other gross part of the game I mentioned, by the way. But like I said, they do something really good with it. After that, we decide to go ahead and help 2 other people. Now, those other 2 people are some interesting levels, but not really in the typical mental health way. Give me 1 moment, please. My beloved mother just decided to say hi. Sorry about that. Let's do Cassie first, Cassiopeia, even though we did her second, because I want to end on a certain point. Cassia's compartmentalization. Now, compartmentalization is actually a very healthy and human thing to do. In fact, I mentioned this with Mia's level back in the first game. Being able to compartmentalize to some extent or another is a very valuable tool. And frankly, we all do it to some extent or another. There's a brilliant line, it's only mentioned once, where Raz says, I want to talk to the real Cassiopeia. And she says, well, which one's the real me? Which one's the real you? Is it the you are with your friends or your loved one, or out amongst strangers, or in a dangerous situation? Which one of those is you? Because we all do that to some extent or another, whether we're aware of it or not. And how much control we have over it just depends on how much discipline and practice we have with that. I admit I tend to be a very compartmentalized person myself, but a lot of that has to do with just the structure of it, which of course appeals to my brain. But as we go through, we learn about her past and what she went through, and we get a few tidbits and snippets of identity. But my favorite part, other than the boss fight, which is actually a really well-designed boss fight, holy crap, I mean all of them are, is how they all merge in the end to just form her. And he's like, are you the real Cassiopeia? She's like, yeah, probably. Might be me, I don't know. But that leads us to Bob. I praised the hair level, with good reason, but the Bob stage is the best done stage in the game. Best executed, best core idea, best presentation, best everything. You're on an island. You have a boat. You can sail around. There's some optional stuff you can do. You could talk to figments of his friends who all dismiss him and talk about how pathetic and terrible he was, how they're not actually his friend, how they don't actually like him. And you might start to think this is a little bit of the same thing that we had earlier with Compton. We go into the first stage into a bottle, and there we find a moth. And the moth is like, in this innocent, sweet little voice, says, oh, I need to protect you from this. Don't worry, I'll make sure you don't get it. It's a seed. Now, the reason it's a seed is because he's big into horticulture. But the point is, or horticulture, is that right? I think it's horticulture. Whatever. The point is, he's into plants, so, that makes a degree of sense. But my favorite part of all of this is when we go in there, he yells at us and slams the door on us. And then the plants open the door and allow us to, and give permission to go into his mind. Now, you're probably thinking, why is that a cool thing? Because plants don't have minds. They're not animals or whatever. They can't communicate like the bees can. Instead, these plants are being controlled by him. How many people suffering from some kind of issue push people away, while wanting help. In the stage this is presented too, sometimes the plants are helpful, and sometimes they are hurtful. Sometimes they are quite literally both at the same time. And there's some cool gameplay gimmicks. The level design's good. What do you want from me? I'm going to be honest, though, even though I actually have some second-hand experience with this, and primarily third-hand experience with this, it took me a while to realize what was going on with this one. It's bloody subtle at first. We get our first couple of seeds, and they don't care for him, and he's hesitant to keep trying, and maybe he just wants to stay safe. You know, maybe it's just safer to not even try this. And each time the moth is trying to screw with us, we have this little mini boss fight, and we find out that Bob and Fullbear were lovers who actually ended up getting married. It's really sweet. It's super cute. But the full timeline is he found his mother dead from drinking herself to death after she had her husband, his father, died in a war. We're not sure which war. It doesn't matter. So she's dead. Cool. Then he goes on, you know, he's a psychic. He works with plants. He goes to join the Psychonauts. We don't know specifically what happens. By the way, very little of this is called out. This is one of my favorite parts about this level. Like I said, it's brilliantly designed. There's no point at which it says, and then his mother killed himself. Instead, we go into a greenhouse, and we hear his voice saying, "Mother, are you in here?" And we find the seed right next to a statue in her likeness. And the whole area is just flooded with bottles. And that's how they tell it. I'm not doing this level a service. Really, this level is worth the price of admission right here. I'm being completely sincere about that. We find out that something happened, probably some things, probably for a long period of time, and he gets fired from the Psychonauts. Then he gets married. That one ray of light, that one bit of sunshine. And we don't see the fourth event because we don't have to. We know what happened to the fourth event because by this point in time, we've already been in to Fullbear's mind. You know, the Psy King level. We already know how that went. He died, or everyone thought he died. Now please picture that for a moment. Your mother died, and you lose your job to your alcoholism. Okay, that sucks, but you meet the love of your life. He helps you get straight. Everything's cool. Everything's better. You're doing better. He dies. I cannot put into words how well crafted this stage is, because it is a perfect encapsulation of alcoholism. Now, let's go ahead and get a proviso out there. A lot of people have a lot of different reactions to alcoholism and the addictive consequences thereof. Everyone's different, etc. But it's very clear that they not only put more effort into this than usual, but someone on the development staff, possibly more than someone, either has first or second-hand experience with alcoholism to be able to craft this so perfectly. Oh, by the way, the moth was it. As you go through, the moth starts to say things a little bit differently. I'm the one who can keep you safe. You don't have to feel this pain. There'll be other pain, but you don't need this one. And there's all sorts of little quietly insidious things the innocent little voice of the moth says, as it represents the alcoholism itself. We go through another awesome boss fight and finally manage to pull him to a point where he can accept getting out of this. Now, in real life, someone just deciding to quit being an alcoholic isn't really a thing. I mean, it has happened, and it has even happened successfully, but I'm willing to let it go for the same reason I'm willing to let everything else go. We're literally jumping into their minds to heal them. I think at that point we can give them a little leeway on that. And he gets back together with Fullbear, and it's really cute. Oh, there's even this great scene where he goes to kiss him. And remember, Fullbear's in someone else's body, so Fullbear says, no, not on borrowed lips. And that's awesome. I'm just saying, Wonder Woman, 1984, maybe, just... The final stages primarily deal with the main villain of the work, who I haven't even mentioned yet. Now, I was curious about this because it's really obvious very early on the structure of who the villain is. The villain is the Tsar's son, who has currently been who has used to be the mailman person and switched his brain with the head of Psychonauts and has been infiltrating them and is operating as the mole in order to cause all this stuff to bring Maligula back. All of that stuff is stuff you can put together within the first 3 or 4 hours of the game. It's really early. We don't even get his name until quite a bit later, and we don't get any real characterization for him until we actually go into his mind. Little pro tip, while you're in the It's a Small World stages, there's actually little side areas, optional side areas you can go into to break the music so it stops playing. You're welcome. Gristle is astonishingly well written for how relatively little screen time he gets. A word I don't like to use, because I feel that the internet in general misuses this word, is the word man-child. What it refers to is someone who never grew up, who stayed surface level in terms of thoughts and processes, and never actually dug into the depths of complexity or nuance or subtlety in all aspects of life, or maybe just a specific one. Gristle is one of the most well-written man-childs I have ever seen. He is brilliantly constructed to be amazingly surface level and to not even have the tiniest bit of understanding of anything he's doing while still being a fully functional, fully fleshed out human being, which is terrifying because I've known people like that. My favorite tidbit, there's so many little things. He likes caviar. You know why he likes caviar? Because it's expensive. There's a point at which he says that his nation, Grulovia, was an awesome nation. And the main character, Raz, says, no, it wasn't. And his response was, yes, it was. I had a cotton candy maker in my bedroom. In case you missed that, the mindset was, I had this really awesome bit of hedonistic luxury. Therefore, the entire country I was going to be in, the kind of country that I lived in, was amazing because I had it good. Think about it. He is such a narcissist in the actual, not in the typical casual usage of the word, in the more clinical sense of the word, that it's actually insane that he was able to maintain his cover. If I'm being honest, it's one of the biggest plot holes of the game, that he somehow magically was able to maintain his cover in a giant organization of psychics when he when he himself has no psychic power. But then again, the first room we see when we enter his mind says all it needs to. I am this person, this is your daughter, these are your things, this is me, yada, yada, yada. It's only when we dig below that, below the surface, that we actually see what kind of an absolutely despicable nothing he is. As an aside, this is one of the most clear-cut examples of a Krennic character I have ever seen. In fact, if I had somehow played this game before Rogue One, then I would probably be calling it the Gristle instead of the Krennic. Ultimately, we beat the bad guys, save everything. We're all happy. Yay. Family is cool. Some people they're not actually fully forgiven, but they're working towards it or starting to move forwards. And Hollis gets the 2-week vacation she really needs, which hopefully is real. There's a lot of hooks left for possible future DLCs or sequels, even though developers said they're not going to. And there's a nice, for those of you who don't know what it is, there's a nice little post-game thing. It's not really post-game in the strictest sense. It's more like you can keep playing at 100%. But everybody says new stuff. You can go around talking to people and get little tidbits of extra story, which is awesome. This was a very good game. I thought I'd share this right at the end here. The golden number for this one was 196 point something. Like I said, 5th highest game I've reviewed to date in the current system. This is a damn good game. Next up, which we will not be doing until next Monday, we'll be starting the God of War trilogy. It'll be interesting to see how that one lines up. I hope you've enjoyed my thoughts as always. I'll see you next time.